Hello and welcome to the Palladian Park podcast. Today we're going to talk about one of our blog posts all about fallacies. So Collin's going to start us off and give us a quick overview of what fallacies are before we get into the rest of the blog post.
Yeah, sure. A fallacy really it affects how you communicate your thoughts and ideas to others, and specifically in persuasions and arguments. So what fallacies are, they are the use of faulty reasoning in the construction of your arguments. And it should be noted that using fallacies isn't a bad thing in itself because your ultimate goal in an argument is to persuade your audience into agreement with you. And you're trying to get them to come over to your side and see things the way that you do. So if you can do this with the use of fallacies, then that's fair game. However, because fallacies are faulty reasoning or faulty logic, if you get caught on it, then you, or maybe at least your argument, could be in trouble. So while I say they're fair game, proceed with caution. So that's basically what fallacies are in a nutshell. Actually, there are two different types of fallacies. And Jenna, do you want to cover those?
Yeah, so basically fallacies are divided into two categories, formal and informal. Formal fallacies are areas of logic where the conclusion doesn't actually follow the premise. So really the flaw there is in the structure of the argument itself. And then when you're talking about informal fallacies, the error is actually in the argument rather than in the structure of it. So informal fallacies rely more on like false assumptions or irrelevant information altogether. So that's another way to parse out fallacies and distinguish between different ones.
Yeah, in our blog post, we have just a handful of fallacies. We're obviously not going through all of them. That would take a very, very long time. But we did lay out a few that are kind of the more common ones, and it's really just in alphabetical order. So, Jenna, if you're ready, we'll just dive right in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so I'll take the first one. It's called ad hominem fallacy. And really what this is, it's a tactic where instead of addressing an argument or an idea or an issue, you instead attack the person who has that argument, that idea, or that issue. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to undermine what they stand for. You're trying to make it seem like they don't have any expertise in the area or they're a hypocrite or something like that. And so you're really working to cast this shroud of doubt around somebody's character. And it's you don't have to look very far to see this in use, especially in politics. The issue with this is that you're not really addressing the issue at all, and you can be called on it. So the argument itself about the issue is kind of left wanting, and instead you're redirecting it at the person themselves.
Great. Anything else? I think you nailed that one.
Nope.
Okay, well, I'll take the next one then. So this is the anecdotal evidence fallacy. And this occurs when someone makes an argument based on evidence collected in a non-scientific manner, basically relying on anecdotes or testimonials. So it's basically, as we know, basing things on stories. And while narratives are compelling and we like to listen to them, that's part of the reason why we so easily fall prey to this one, because you hear someone's story and it's very compelling and you want to believe it and that it'll work for everybody. And that's just not the case. And the big problem of that is it's very problematic it's basically too limited a sample size, and also it's based on human memory, which is not reliable at all. That's been proven over and over again that it's not really a moral issue, it's a human issue of just our memories get less and less reliable over time. So they're not to be taken with a grain of salt, anything that's relied upon with memory. Quick example we kind of use for this one, a friend could tell you about how they had a cancer diagnosis and then they switched to a plant-based diet and they went into remission. They swear that diet cured cancer, that other patients should do the same. While maybe it contributed to it, maybe it didn't, there's no scientific evidence behind that argument, and so it's worthwhile to look into more evidence to see if it's actually worthwhile. And also people are so different that something can work for one person and not for another, and so it's good to get all the information and not rely solely on anecdotes.
Yeah, good one. Next one, moving into burden of proof fallacy. Burden of proof fallacy, really kind of what it sounds like is where somebody makes a claim for something, and even if they don't have any supporting evidence of it, they assert that their claim is true if somebody cannot disprove it. So instead of them having to prove it for it to be true, they're instead shifting the burden to the other party to disprove it. And so this can take shape in a whole host of different ways. But the example that we used is that somebody, if they have an item and it goes missing, they could claim that it's stolen. And if people cannot disprove that it was stolen, then they're asserting that that is what indeed happened, even though it could have been misplaced could have been moved on accident, could have been borrowed instead of stolen. Lots of different options, but in this example, they are asserting that it was stolen if it could not be disproved.
That just made me think of such an obvious example I hadn't really thought of, was that this is one thing our justice system gets supremely right, of guilty or innocent until proven guilty. It's quite a remarkable thing because it's burden of proof fallacy is an easy way out, kind of. And so while our system has many flaws and other things, but that part of it is really great and really combats this fallacy. I'd never really thought about it in that light, but I think it's a good example of when our systems get it right and combat the fallacy.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a good point.
Great. Well, I think you nailed that one. So the next one is correlation and causation fallacy. And this occurs when one assumes that correlation equals causation. And in actuality, you can't do that. You can't legitimately deduce a cause-effect relationship between two variables if it's based only solely on a correlation between them. And so in our blog post, we also note that it is perfectly fine to note a correlation, right? Correlation has its place, its time and place. It's just making sure to not add too much import on the fact of that and let it tread into associating that correlation equals causation. A great example I found that made me laugh. It's always good to have an absurd example kind of to highlight the point. And so there is a graph that somebody made that basically on the y-axis you have total U.S. highway fatality rates, and then fresh lemons imported to the USA from Mexico. And it shows a linear line so that the more lemons we imported, the less fatalities that we had. And so if you look at that, it's a pretty good line straight down. And if it was a less absurd thing, you could see how someone would say, yeah, if they were more closely related, not as absurd as this one, how it would be so easy to just say, well, yeah, that's the cause of it. So
yeah, just keep importing lemons.
Yeah, exactly. Less people will die. All the lemon growers will be thrilled. All the farmers will be like, please keep peddling this narrative. Yeah, this one I feel like most people have heard of, but it's so easy to fall victim to this one. That's good to keep it on the front of your mind.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Even though everybody knows it, it seems like it's one of those where you know it, but you still fall victim to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, moving right along, false dilemma fallacy is the next one. This one is, they're all kind of manipulative, but this one kind of especially so, where you are trying to manipulate the other party into choosing something that you want, and by doing so, you are presenting them with the options that you want them to choose from. And that inherently means that you are not presenting them with all the options. So really, you can say, all right, here's the situation. You can do either this or you can do that. So you're presenting them with two options, and it's the tailored options to your will. And there could be 5 or 6 different options that might be better for the other party or something along those lines. But your job is to persuade with rhetoric. And so that's what this fallacy is trying to help you accomplish by giving them options that you want them to choose from.
Yeah, it feels very much like about control, of acting like you're giving all
Mm-hmm.
the options, but really keeping control and steering where people, the options they have.
All right, I'll do the next one too. False equivalence fallacy. And so this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's where two different things that they might share something in common, and just because they share that in common, they are treated as the same. And so a common phrase for this is, people will say, well, that's comparing apples and oranges. They are both fruit. They share that common trait of being fruit, but they're not the same thing. And so the example that we included in this is kind of one of our favorites, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's where they have this scene, and a woman is being accused of being a witch, and basically they're trying to figure out if she is indeed a witch or not. And they do that by weighing her against a duck. And if you haven't seen it, I won't spoil it, but they go through this whole exercise of getting to that point of why it might make sense for her to be weighed against a duck to determine if she's a witch or not. So it's just brilliantly absurd and entertaining.
Also, it's so fun to listen to something that absurd, because watching it's already absurd and very funny. But then, listening to you try to seriously describe what's going on is incredible. Because, it's so different because you're so not used to, hearing it described out loud in a serious way. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think you came up with that example. It's so perfect.
Yep. Thank you, Monty Python.
Yeah. The gift that keeps on giving. Okay, well, the next one, this is kind of a good jumping off point then to hasty generalization fallacy. They're not exactly the same, but you'll see similarities a little bit, kind of jumping to conclusions a little bit. So this one is when a general statement or rule is made based on insufficient or unrepresentative sample of data. And this basically happens when the name's very indicative of what it is, right? When an instance of something happens and you exhibit something or a trait of something and then conclude that all other instances must exhibit that same trait. And so you could kind of say at times a false equivalence fallacy could be underneath hasty generalization fallacy. Not all the time, but it is a similar thing where you falsely equate to two traits or two things that don't go together. And so some simple examples we included. It can get a lot more complicated, but we like to start with the baseline and go deeper of just like when you see a teenager run a red light and then you're like, all teenagers are awful drivers. You hear people talk about like my dad or my uncle has always eaten like pizzas, burgers, and fries for the past 15 years and has had no health issues. So fast food can't be that bad for you. Or you go to a lecture and you're like, the first lecture of the course was boring, so I can tell the whole course is going to be boring. It basically removes the nuance of things, which is where I guess, mainly see that tie into the false equivalence, where it really is taking away the apples and oranges, like you were talking about. It's fruit, but they're not the same fruit, and that's adding nuance to the situation. And basically both of these fallacies remove nuance. This is kind of, I think, to default reaction. Our brains naturally do this really quickly. It's an easy way to simplify the world because the world is so complex that it's a natural process we all do. And so it's just important to power through. Like first thought usually isn't best thought. We say that a lot. So it's just good to realize, wow, I just made a really quick generalization. I should look further into that and look at all the details and the nuance.
Yep. Well said.
Well, the next one's mine as well. Actually, the next two are mine, so you're going to get sick of my voice. So the middle ground fallacy, also known as the argument to moderation, is the assumption that a compromise between two extremes or conflicting views is always true. And that's not the case at all. It ignores the possibility, basically, that one or both extremes could be completely true or false. It's another way of saying that the middle ground is absolutely the right way. Everything's always in the middle, which we know is at times is true. Very often, actually, a point is between two extremes. If you say that all the time, it's incorrect, because at times there are things that are further one way or the other. So I think examples actually help the most with illustrating this point. So it's like John thinks vaccines cause autism. Michelle, a medical doctor, says that this claim has been proven false. Therefore, vaccinations cause autism sometimes, right? And so that perfectly illustrates that idea of, because we usually think a middle ground is a good thing. And it's a perfect example of balance of all things, right? Because it's not always. People are sometimes right and wrong. And so we love to live in the gray area, but it's important to know that. Another example, you could say, this one's really silly, but I like it, of Sophia thinks the sky is blue, Jane thinks the sky is yellow, therefore the sky must be green. So it's showing that the middle ground is not always the right way. Oftentimes it is, but making sure that you keep the full spectrum and understand and don't always compromise when something's incorrect in that regard.
Yeah, I love your examples.
Cool. Well, from there then, we'll talk about the red herring fallacy. This is a good one. Most people have at least heard of this. It's basically when somebody deliberately introduces an irrelevant topic into a discussion with the intention of diverting attention away from the main relevant topic. I think that's an important part, with the intention. It's intentional. And kind of like we talked about earlier, this one nowadays in almost any political discourse and debate, there's red herrings everywhere. And I have an example with Donald Trump, but believe me, you can go on any side, Republican, Democrat, Independent. It's there all the time. This was just such a clear example that we had there's a video linked to something he talked about, but by no means does he own that or do Republicans own that. It's all across the board. And so I'll let you, if you want to go to our website, you can talk about it. It's basically him saying, he was asked about the Billy Bush scandal in the locker room talk, and he's like, it's locker room talk, and it's one of those things. And then he goes, I will knock the hell out of ISIS. We're going to defeat ISIS. ISIS happened a number of years ago in a vacuum that was left because of bad judgment, and I will tell you, I will take care of ISIS. So when you hear that, you started with the issue and then immediately goes to ISIS, which catches your attention. So that's a rather extreme example. But yeah, you can find it pretty much anywhere. So with this, the best strategy, because that can be the most difficult thing, is how do you deal with a red herring when you spot it? So first, it's to be aware of it, but then to point out why the statement or argument is irrelevant to the issue or problem that you raised initially or somebody else did. And then once you identify and verbalize it, you can try to attempt to redirect the conversation back to the original topic.
Yeah, it probably takes a little bit of verbal and rhetorical skill too to get back on track.
Mm-hmm. When I was reading and researching for that one too, it's basically using your best judgment, because at times if somebody doesn't really want to discourse with you and it just keeps doing that, sometimes it's better to cut your losses and try something else. So it's good to attempt, but you're not always, like you said, it takes a lot of skill to do it. So it's not always possible, but give it the good college try.
Yep. All right. Anything else on that one?
I don't think so.
All right. Keep moving along here. Strongman fallacy is the next one. And so it's strawman fallacy is where you are taking the argument of somebody else and you are purposefully distorting it or exaggerating it. And really you're doing that because when you do so, you're making it easier to attack. You're changing the argument that somebody else has to fit yourself a little bit more to where you can exploit it for your audience's purpose of persuading them. So what that is, it becomes, instead of a real man, like the original argument, you are taking it and reconstructing it into a false man. And it's much easier to attack a false man, or in this case, a straw man, than a real one. And so the example that we use to kind of help illustrate this is a couple senators talking about national defense budget. And so Senator A says, our national defense budget has ballooned and is preventing us from spending money on critical services. We cannot increase the budget further. And Senator B takes that and turns it into a straw man by saying, my colleague is proposing to leave our nation defenseless. I, for one, cannot tolerate this, especially with all the dangers in the world. So that's kind of how it works. Really pretty straightforward. You are recreating the other side's argument for your own purpose.
Yeah, it's like willfully misunderstanding. It's like warping it to your own will and what you want.
Yeah, that's a really good word, warping it, because that's exactly what you're doing. Yep.
Yeah, it's maddening when it happens to you.
Okay, sunk cost fallacy is the next one, and like a few others on the list, this should be at least sound familiar to a lot of people. So sunk costs are costs. They are financial, energy, time, anything like that. Anything that you have that you can expend upon something. And so the sunk ones are the ones that you have already allocated. They've already been incurred. And so the fallacy part of this is committed when you continue to allocate more of your resources, more of your costs into a project for the sole reason because you've already sunk some in. And so basically we have this feeling, this bias to thinking that because we've already worked on something, because we've already invested time in it or energy or something, that we have to keep going, which that's not the case. It really, at multiple junctures throughout a project, you should be reevaluating if it's still worthwhile pursuing. And when you do that, you should make sure that you do not take into consideration the amount of time and resources that you've already sunk into it, because those are in the past, though they should not have any influence on the future. And so this can be used not only in our thinking, but also in our arguing, in our persuasion as to why we should continue working on a project or we should continue pursuing something, because we've already come this far. Really, you should, like I said, keep reevaluating. And when it makes sense to cut ties, then cut ties. Sometimes they will be cut at a loss, but if you can cut it at a loss earlier rather than later, then it's a much smaller loss.
Yeah, I really like how you distinguish too between financial, energy, time, like all the resources, because so often I think the default is to think of money, which is an important one, but time, especially in energy, it's like that can add, even if you spend a ton of money, but also a bunch of manpower and time, it just makes it so much more difficult to overcome and to get off the sinking ship, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely.
Wonderful. I also liked how you talked about to think about this in our arguments and how we're being persuasive with people. So I don't think it's thought of that way. Like when you said that to me, I really enjoyed that, because I think it's important too to realize how often, like, it shouldn't be the baseline argument to say we've come this far. So what does that actually mean, right? It's really not indicative of the facts of what's going on. And so yeah, I really like it, thinking of it that way too. Of it's not the best strategy, but often people say that in arguments of talking about discourse about a project or an endeavor.
Right. Yep.
Wonderful. Well, with that, unless you have anything else to add, I think we'll go to this is the last one. Tu quoque fallacy. It's basically Latin for you also. Really appeals to the argument of hypocrisy. It's attacking an opponent or a person's behavior, basically saying it's inconsistent with their argument. Yeah, I think we said it answers criticism with criticism, which I like. It's focusing on someone's personal shortcomings rather than disproving the logic of the argument. This is one that happens a lot because it's easier, and especially in our online world now, a lot of people default to this because I feel like it's less taught now how to argue. Less people were learning that. Maybe I'm biased in that thinking, but it's not as widespread to having discourse and argument, and because disproving arguments is not an easy task, especially if you haven't been taught how to do it properly. And so now a lot of people, instead of having, enough knowledge and nuanced discourse to understand and disprove an argument, the logic of an argument, it's easier to default and focus on the shortcomings of the person rather than of the argument. And we've all done this in different ways, so it's a good one to keep in mind, to just realize when you see it in others, but also within yourself, to say, what is my problem with the argument? What's the shortcoming of the argument, not the person itself? Because it's much more telling that way than it's almost a distraction from the issue at hand. So a small version of this, the example I included, is basically like a father tells the son, you should stop smoking cigarettes, they're not healthy. And the son goes, why would I listen to you? You've smoked cigarettes since you were 14. It's a simple example, but there's a lot of those.
It's kind of like the pot calling the kettle black.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's that thing too. Sometimes maybe someone themselves can't execute what they're saying, but they do have the knowledge or wisdom to know, and so it can be difficult to listen sometimes. But sometimes they know better, or sometimes, right? If someone's been a smoker for a long time, they really know the ramifications. They may be so addicted and have a hard time getting rid of it. So there is hypocrisy there, and there's some validity to feeling that initial frustration, or like, you don't know, or who are you to tell me that kind of feeling. But they might have such a deep knowledge of that they know best to be like, don't do this. Even if they can't physically get out of whatever it is, if they are struggling to actually execute to not do that behavior, they might be the best one to tell you, even though it can be frustrating at first to hear it from them. And
yeah, that's a good flashback to survivorship bias from our previous post. You shouldn't only look at the survivors, the winners. You should take into consideration the people who, like you said, have fallen victim to whatever it may be, if it's an addiction or something like that. It's super easy to say, well, you're an addict, why should I listen to you? When instead, a very plausible explanation is, well, you're an addict, that's exactly why I should listen to you.
That's such a wonderful tie, and I'd never made that exact connection before. That's they do really go hand in hand, kind of the opposite of both sides. So, yeah, I love that. I think that's spot on.
Mm-hmm.
Look at you being all smart.
Get lucky sometimes.
Awesome. Well, with that, I think, you want to wrap us up, Collin?
Sure, yeah. So that is all of the fallacy examples that we have for this blog post. Like we said, this is in no way comprehensive whatsoever. This is very abbreviated, but it is kind of the more common one. So that's the reason why we included these. But just to recap, fallacies are flaws in argument, and they can be used, well, lots of people use them on purpose, both on purpose and on accident. And the issue with using them on accident is you don't know that you are, and so you are opening yourself up. Kind of like what we said at the beginning, using fallacies in the art of persuasion is fair game. However, they are faulty logic, and so you can get called on them. And so if you know you're doing it, then you're playing a different game. It's less risk, and you can kind of plan for, okay, what happens if my opponent is savvy to these tactics. If you are doing this on accident and you don't know about it, then you're exposing yourself to losing that argument because your opponent might be savvy to it and you yourself aren't.
Yeah, you're not prepared.
Right, exactly. Yep. So kind of regardless of the scenario, if you know about fallacies and are trying to use them in an argument, or you don't know about them, both situations, if you improve your understanding of fallacies, your ability to argue and persuade increases astronomically.
Yeah. I think it benefits you both ways, right? Of knowing yourself, like you said, because you can get called out at any moment. So it's better to know and be intentional about using them. And hopefully, I think if you're smart in the long game, right, for longevity's sake, minimize your use of them, because especially if you're going at savvy people, they will call it out. And that ties into then the other worthwhile part of it is also then you can see it in other people. So when you're talking and discoursing with other people, you can identify, fallacies they're using. And then, especially if it's actually very much a discourse in a debate, you can call them out on it and try to get real answers and get more to the meat of the argument and not get distracted by the fallacies.
Exactly. Well put. Well, with that is all we have. So thank you very much for listening, and we will catch you on the next one.